It's a pleasure to be here. And as Bree said, it's my first time here. So I didn't really know what to expect. And I've already been really, really impressed with all of you. Um, and so I want this to be more interactive because, it's hard to create a presentation about building an interdisciplinary team. What I thought would be more helpful is to talk to you about how I did it and what I thought about as I was doing it, and then give you sort of an example of what it looks like. And I want you to be able to ask questions, throughout. So please do ask me as things come up. So, I have been at Rush for 25 years now. This is my 25th year. It was my first job off a postdoc. So it's research center, and I run 2 community-based cohort studies. So today I want to talk about building this program of research to understand aging and Alzheimer's dementia in African Americans, and just sort of give you an example of the types of questions we can ask with interdisciplinary teams. And I'll do this by, showing you some data on some unique risk factors for cognition that we've looked at in this population. Also, for the people who might be a bit more on the biology side, trying to understand potential brain mechanisms linking risk factors to cognitive decline. These are the types of questions you can ask with this kind of design. And I want you to kind of see what is involved with creating an infrastructure like this. But first, I want to level set because I know everyone is not from the Alzheimer's world. So I'm pretty sure that you all know, though, that Alzheimer's dementia is among the most feared diseases of old age, right? And for those of you who don't know the difference between Alzheimer's and the other dementias, you can think about dementia as being this umbrella term that's just used to describe a range of symptoms associated with cognitive impairment. And then you have the different types of dementia underneath the umbrella. And so Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, affecting between 50 to 75% of people. It's a slow progressive disease, with the primary manifestation being memory problems, but you also have other changes in cognition. It accounts for about 2/3 of dementia in older adults. And currently, about 6 million Americans have Alzheimer's dementia. And this number is going to grow to about 12 to 16 million unless we can find a cure. It's very age related. About 33 to 50% of adults over the age of 85 have Alzheimer's, and women account for most of the cases, about 2/3. And we don't know why. Part of the reason people think is because women live longer, but that's not the only reason. It's probably something about the biology. It's a very expensive disease. And as I said, there's no cure. But in the news, if you follow the news, the FDA has recently approved 2 drugs to treat Alzheimer's dementia, lecanemab and donanemab. And so people have been all in a frenzy because these are the first drugs in 20 years that actually seem like they're doing something to the biology. All the other drugs have just been to treat the symptoms. This is actually, removing the amyloid plaques from the brain and presumably slowing cognition, although the jury's still out on that. So this is a paper that we published a few years ago, just to give you a sense of the impact of this disease. About 6 million adults over the age of 65 had clinical Alzheimer's dementia in 2020, but that number is going to increase to about 14 million in 2060. And you can see that it's very age related. So the gray and yellow bars are the numbers of people over the ages of 75 and 85. And each bar is hard to see, but each bar is a year. So all the way going out to 2060, you can see that the numbers are going to dramatically increase for those over the age of 75. At the same time, it's becoming this public health crisis. We also have this changing demographics of our nation, right? Where we're becoming much more diverse. So, the first, this is from the U.S. Census. So the first bar shows you the people of color made up about 39% of the population in 2016. But by 2050, we're going to make up about half, a little bit over half of the population. And so why is this important, this increasing diversity? because Alzheimer's dementia is a health disparity. It's thought that African Americans are about 2 times more likely than white Americans to have Alzheimer's dementia. They're also less likely to receive a diagnosis. And when they do get the diagnosis, it's at much later stages, much greater severity, which really knocks them out for the drugs that are out there, because the drugs are really for early Alzheimer's dementia. They're also under-included in clinical trials. So, all of the science that's moving forward so quickly, African Americans are being left out because they're not in these trials. So this is a picture of the disparity. This is data from a large study that was done at Kaiser in Northern California, where they looked at the medical records of about 270,000 people. And the nice thing about this study is that they actually had a broad range of different races and ethnicities. If you look at the literature, it's really mostly on white Americans. There's, some on African Americans and Latinos, but you never see any data on these other groups. It's almost like they're invisible. So even though there's a lot of, disaggregation that needs to be done within, this is a first step to be able to get those data. But what you can see is that African Americans had the highest incidence of all the other groups, followed really closely by American Indian and Alaska Natives. Latinos and Pacific Islanders were about intermediate, and whites, but Asian Americans actually had the lowest risk. So this is a disparity that I have been trying to focus on and try to understand. But the thing about understanding this disparity is that you have to also understand the background of cognition. So the diagnosis of Alzheimer's dementia relies heavily on cognitive test performance. But we know performance is really correlated with education, and it's influenced by many other factors outside of education, which I have many of them listed on this little Venn diagram. And these factors also vary by race. So when, thinking about the research question, you have to be able to incorporate all of these different factors, because you can't just rely on the fact that African Americans are scoring lower on these cognitive function tests because of either lack of education or, or less education or less education quality. There's all these other factors that play a role that people have really ignored. And most studies have been cross-sectional. So if you look at African Americans at one snapshot moment and you see that they're not performing as highly on these tests that are used to make the diagnosis, you're going to think that they have a greater prevalence of the disease. But we know that cognitive decline is fundamentally a change in performance over time, right? So people are aging at different rates. So if you want to understand cognitive aging in a population, you need to design a longitudinal study to be able to address that question. And so that's what I wanted to do. So given that the hallmark feature of Alzheimer's is cognitive decline, we need longitudinal studies to measure change over time. We can't continue to rely on cross-sectional studies, although they are important and they're cheaper, but you have to be able to supplement with longitudinal designs. But there's a problem. The problem is what we've been talking about, in some of our small groups. African Americans are severely underrepresented in Alzheimer's disease research, just like many other conditions. A study that was done recently looked at a lot of the major research studies, and they found that about 80% of the populations in all these studies are white, older white adults. And you can see the breakdown for the other groups. Blacks are about 11%. But it's hard to understand disparities when you have so few people coming from these populations, right? And so how do we begin to change the landscape of what's out there? And one really pressing issue that we have to face, which I'm sure you all know about, is trust. So the Alzheimer's Association, they put on these focus groups where they asked, a number of different questions about, research and healthcare. And these two questions really stuck out to me. So one is the percentage, figure 20 on the left, the percentage of adults who believe medical research is biased against people of color. You can see that Black Americans were the highest at 62%. And you can see the, the breakdown for the other groups, but they were the most likely to say that medical research is biased against people of color. And then on the other figure, the percentage of US adults who trust an Alzheimer's cure will be shared equally, regardless of race, color, or ethnicity. Black Americans, again, were the least likely to believe that would happen. So here we are at a cusp where we have these two new treatments, and they're not a cure, but they actually can change the course of the biology, what we think. And Black Americans do not believe that's going to be shared equally, regardless of race, color, or ethnicity. So that's a real problem that we as researchers have to face, right? So when you think about designing your team and your question, you want to be able to have people on your team that you believe are trustworthy, that can be the face for your study, right? You can't go in there and think that, like, even though I'm Black American, right, I still represent a white institution. So I had to go in and do certain things to build trust. I couldn't just go on my face the way I looked, right? So, but I had to know that this was an issue. So whatever your research question is, you need to know the background and what the barriers are so that when you create your team, you have the right people on the team. The other issue that we had to really tackle with and understand was the recruitment practices in this particular area. So most studies of Alzheimer's use passive recruitment strategies that are not centered in communities of color. So they tend to recruit from well-resourced clinics and academic medical centers, where they'll just hang up a flyer in a memory clinic or any kind of clinic and think that that's going to get them participants. Well, that's going to just have selection bias, right? Because we know that minoritized populations have, less access to healthcare. And even when they do, there might be a fractured relationship and they're not going to trust being in a research study. So that's, but that's what people rely on, these kind of passive recruitment strategies. And also there's a lot of inclusion exclusion criteria that favor white participants. So you have to have few chronic comorbidities to get into a study. You have to have access to transportation. So in building your research, you have to be able to address these types of barriers so that you can overcome them and not face the same plight that these other people have faced, and then not have anybody in your study of people of color. So I have tried to overcome many of these, and I'm sure there's many other barriers that I have not been able to overcome, but by building a program that really tries to center diversity in cognitive aging. And so these are some of the factors that I had to consider in building my team. So I wanted to understand cognitive aging in Black people and how that might eventually lead to dementia. So I want to understand risk factors, right? And because I think it's a life course disease, I wanted to be able to look at early and late life factors. Also, there's a strong genetic component to the disease. So I have to be able to get biological samples to be able to measure, genetics. So think about your team. It's another expertise that I would need on my team. I'm not a geneticist, I'm a neuropsychologist. And I want to be able to understand individual level experiences as well as environmental factors. These are all different types of expertise that I would have to have on my team. And in doing this, I wanted to be able to build an infrastructure that would allow me to increase inclusion, not only of the participants that I'm studying, but also build it for scholars to be able to use these data for their dissertation or for, papers or grants and things like that. And really try to expand the narrative on minority aging, because I know the narrative that I was seeing in the literature was very limited to just a homogeneous population's experience. And it did not reflect my own experience as a Black woman. So in building my team, I had to first start with community, because I've already told you I was not going to rely on the passive recruitment strategy of just hanging a flyer in our memory clinic. I knew I needed to go to where people were. So that meant that I had to be able to develop community networks, and I needed an outreach team. So I immediately hired someone on the team who was really connected to a lot of different community organizations in Chicago. And she was instrumental in introducing me to the key gatekeepers in Chicago, where I needed to go and make a relationship and tell them about my research and why it was important. And they would open the door for me to be able to meet with different communities. And so I spent probably 50% of my time in the community giving presentations. So that's me on this side, talking to a tennis group that I found in Chicago that they had been getting together for 40 years. So I went out there, I took some food, and because people love to eat, and I gave a presentation right there on the tennis court about healthy aging. And I was able to recruit more than half of those people. On the other side is I have a neurologist on my team because we're studying Alzheimer's disease. So we have to have a neurologist. And so she's also giving presentations on, on whatever the topic is. A lot of times people don't just want to know about Alzheimer's, they want to know about other brain diseases. So she's been instrumental in helping me reach the community. So through these, community outreach efforts, my goal has really been to strengthen the community linkage, right? So that means identifying the key gatekeepers, which I was able to do with the outreach person who knew everyone. Obtain endorsements from community leaders because they are, people will listen to like the pastor at the church or, some organization or some sorority or fraternity. They're going to listen to that person before they listen to me. So getting that person's endorsement really helped me, get through the door and be able to talk to people. Also, what was really instrumental was being involved in community activities. So before I got my first RO1, I was just out there like working health fairs, doing memory screens, any activity that was happening in the community, we made sure we had a table where we, have information about healthy aging, about, whatever, was important for us to build this trust. And we did this for years before I actually got the grant. And then when I went up to do the RO1, I went back to these organizations and I asked for letters of support, and they all, gave it because they knew who I was because I'd been working in the community. And so the first year of the RO1, I was able to recruit 200 people, just because of these connections. Also, the person that I hired, she actually joined a lot of different community advisory boards and worked on various community goals. That also was important. Some people have like a community advisory board that they bring together. Well, we did it the other way around. We had her join different boards and and other staff on the team so that we could represent a greater swath of Chicago. Because when you have like 8 people in your advisory board, you're really only getting those 8 people's opinions. But if you're on like 20 different, organizational boards, you have more that you can try to, target and help people in different ways. We also collaborated with local health departments like the Chicago Department of Public Health. They have a lot of resources, they have a lot of reach. And so we found ways to collaborate with them. I think the most important thing that helped us was that we gave first before we asked anything of the community. And so, like I said, being in the community for a couple years before I actually came back and said, hey, I'm writing this grant, that was sort of a game changer because they didn't think I was coming just when I needed to put the grant in. I had been around for a long time. And then also reporting back to the community, because a big argument that we hear, a big criticism is that these researchers come in like helicopters, swoop down and collect the data, and then they leave. And especially if the money runs out, you never see them again. And the community hates that. So we are constantly reporting back to the community what we're finding, what might be of interest to them and asking their feedback on what we're doing. So I think, anything that you're studying, especially if you're working with the community where there's not a lot of data, I think it's really important to provide education to increase awareness. And I had to start at the very ground zero, with these older adults, 65 and older. I had to start with like, what is research? Why is it important? We can't just assume that everyone knows, everyone took a methodology class and they know what this is about, right? You have to start at the very ground, even like talking about confidentiality and, and concepts that you take for granted. You have to break it down for the community. And we supplemented this with like presentations on Alzheimer's and memory loss and healthy aging. And many times we asked the community what they wanted to hear, because everybody doesn't want to hear about Alzheimer's. It's like a scary disease for people, but they did want to hear about something like, what can I do to have healthy aging? What can I do to prevent memory loss? And what we found was that these presentations were not always just about aging and Alzheimer's. Sometimes we had to address the medical and social needs of the community. So that meant that I had to be able to create um, a partnership with people like a diabetes person, or stroke, or heart disease. And I work in a medical center, so that's not hard. But at your university, I really encourage you to be able to create these partnerships with people in other disciplines, especially if you're focusing on something that may not be the only thing the community wants to hear about. And luckily for us, all these things I just named, diabetes, stroke, heart disease, those are all risk factors for Alzheimer's. So it wasn't a big stretch for me to include these kinds of people, but you may have to think about like, what are some sort of like tangential, disciplines that would help you and help you solidify your research question and include that in your team. And then we gave it like a lot of lunch and learns, and we involved researchers from other disciplines, like I said, and other representing other health conditions. So always pairing food with whatever you do is important. We learned that very early on. So, for the actual grant, I had to make a case for the team that I needed, right? And so I had to think about what are all the aspects of this data collection I'm going to do. So obviously I needed a study coordinator. Because I'm measuring cognition, I needed psychometrists, people who would be trained. They didn't have to have the training themselves, but we were going to train people to give cognitive testing in a standardized, uniform way. We needed nurses and neurologists. Obviously, I'm a neuropsychologist, but I needed other neuropsychologists on the team. And, the study that I'm doing is an epidemiologic observational study. So I needed epidemiologists, I needed biostatisticians. And because I haven't told you this yet, but I also try to get brains from these older African Americans, I needed to have a neuropathologist on the team. And then there was a whole array of support staff that you have to think about, right? You need an administrator. Because it's a longitudinal study, I need a retention specialist. So some people to help me keep participants engaged, because you can't do it by yourself, right? You are the principal investigator, but you need to have a whole infrastructure around you to run a longitudinal study. And what I learned, sort of like probably, I'm now in the fourth cycle of this grant. What I learned in the third cycle was that I needed a social worker, because research was not on the top of people's minds. They had all kinds of things going on. So the social worker is able to connect people to resources so that they don't have to worry about the things that are bothering them in their life, and then they can enroll in research. So, it's a win-win situation. And then because I'm getting blood and brain, I needed lab people. So you think about when you're writing a grant, you have to give a budget justification. So each of these people has a role, and you have to be able to explain what they're going to do on your study. So, so think about what your grant is about and what your question is, know the background, what the barriers are, but think about all the things you need to do to collect the data, and make sure you have people on there that you can justify their role, and then, put those people in your budget. So here are some of the things that we had to do in order to sort of do that, right? So we had to build a case for why I needed all these extra people, the retention specialist, the social worker. So I had to argue that I'm trying to meet community needs, right? So this is just an example of something that we had to do, like this was during COVID. So we would be able to do like free COVID testing or give vaccinations. We ran a program or an activity where we washed clothes of essential workers, because in the minoritized communities, where we're all at home in our cushy, homes on our computers, they still had to go to work. And so we created this event where they could come and bring their laundry, and we paid for it. And, they did their laundry for like We did it like 2 weeks, like 3 or 4 times during COVID. And, and that the participants, they bring their family members, they tell their friends. It was really open. It wasn't just for the study. It was whoever needed. We tried to go around to different communities in Chicago and do this. And it's just a way of building, sort of solidarity with the community so that they see Rush as a trusted, a trusted partner that's there for them. That's just, one example. We also, because it's a longitudinal study, we try to build culturally celebratory retention events. We're trying to keep people in until we can get their brain, right, when they die. So you have to keep them engaged because loss to follow-up is the biggest risk to any longitudinal study. And people drop out, you have no validity. So we try to keep people in as long as possible. So we put on these events, for them, and try to like celebrate older Black adults doing things that they like to do. And, this also includes like being able to give back and, and holding resource fairs. We have like social service resource fairs. We're always communicating and disseminating our findings in layman's terms, not medical jargon that people can understand. And we started doing this newsletter called Graceful Living, where we, just talk about whatever the community wants to hear. We talk about our findings. We try to showcase different parts of the study and we introduce them to staff. So it's really another way for us to kind of stay connected. So those are the kinds of things that we had to do to create this infrastructure. And so now I want to just share with you like some of the types of questions that you can ask once you have this study built. So the study that I've been talking about is called the Minority Aging Research Study. We started enrolling in August of 2004, and it's a rolling admission. So we're still, constantly enrolling. And every time I go back in to get refunded, I have like a target of how many more I want to get for that, for that cycle. So I really want to get to 1,000 people. Right now we're about 800, closer to 850, I think. And the only inclusion criteria is that you have to be at least 65 years of age because we're studying, change in cognition and we're trying to get brains. So I could not enroll people in their 40s because it's going to take 60 years for them to die, right? So you have to be an older adult and they cannot have dementia because once you have dementia, you can't figure out what the risk factors are. So we're enrolling healthy people from the community. We're going to the community. We're recruiting from churches, senior buildings, organizations, and, fraternities, sororities, wherever older Black adults hang out. And so the study is a longitudinal study where we assess risk factors, we measure their cognition, and we take their blood. And all of this is done every year annually in the home. So we never ask anyone to come to Rush. We send out a team to them, an RA who does the risk factor assessment and the cognitive testing. We send a nurse to do the physical exam. We send a phlebotomist to get the blood. And then we follow up with a neurologist or a neuropsychologist to go over their diagnosis. And so all of these are team members that we had to build in, and we had to have a huge travel budget because we are, we're paying for each of these people to go to the homes, and people live all over Chicago. But we've had a really great success. We've had follow-up rates over 90% among those who are still living. And we're currently in our 4th cycle of this NIA award, years 16 to 20. And this is now the longest running all African-American study that NIA has funded. And we're going to be doing with yours next, which will be like 10 times the size of Mars. So super excited about that. So this is what the cohort looks like now. It's a little bit over 850 self-identified older African Americans. It's mostly women. We've heard that again, earlier today, that it's really, really hard to get Black men in research. They're currently about 84 years of age, and they're relatively educated for a Black cohort. It's 14 years, and that's because these are healthy volunteers, and so they tend to have more education. But we've had a lot of people die over time, and about 10% have developed dementia since we started. And then in about 2011, we started recruiting for brain autopsy because if you look at the literature, there was nothing in the literature about the pathology you see in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. And so, that has been a huge contribution, but a very challenging part of this study. So far we've had about half who are alive and active have agreed to brain donation. We have a form called the Anatomical Gift Act that's a valid, a legal form in all 50 states that if you sign it, before you have dementia, we're able to take your brain as a gift. You're basically saying, I will gift my brain to Rush. But of course, that's easier said than done, right? Because somebody has to call us when the person dies. And this is what I did not realize when I started the studies, that older Black adults are very private and they don't want their children in their business. So they're not going to tell them that they're in a study. So, it's been really challenging. And now we have to figure out a way to connect with families, right? It's not just the participant, because we need to actually get the call at death. But we've gotten about 200 brains collected to date, which is more than anyone else in the country. But I can tell you, we have 2 studies of white adults at Rush, and we have 2,500 brains, and been doing it for about the same amount of time. So you can see the amount of effort, 200 versus 2,500. It has been very, very challenging. But in building my team, I learned some lessons, right? So I hired a social psychologist who is a mixed methods person. And so she was able to hold focus groups with the participants and learn what are some barriers to brain donation, what are some facilitators. And so now we're incorporating those things into the study so that we can make sure that we get the brains when people die. Now, Mars is all African-American, which was by design because I wanted to understand within race heterogeneity and really race-relevant factors. But what I faced in the real world were reviewers, grant reviewers, and people, from journals. Where's your white comparison group? How are we going to know that this is valid, what you're finding? You don't have any whites in your sample, which is, it's a shame it's still happening today, but I've been facing this for, since 2004. And it's been an uphill battle. It's getting a little bit easier, I think, especially after George Floyd, but it is really, really still hard. But I have been able to leverage another study at Rush that is about 2,000 older people without dementia, mostly white. And it's very similar. Actually modeled my study off of this study. They all agree to annual detailed clinical evaluations, risk factor assessment, and blood donation. But the difference here is that they all have to agree to brain donation to be in the study. It is a prerequisite to sign up. I knew I couldn't do that with Black people. I would have 0 people in my study. So that was one way I was like, I can't do that. But I have been able to leverage that study because there's significant overlap in risk factors between my study and this one, and we use the same cognitive battery. So I can merge the data and look across race and then answer those people when they're like, well, where's your white comparison group? A lot of times I do push back, but I've been able to use this study when needed. So this is the design of both the studies. We enroll people at baseline with no disease. We document risk factors, and then we measure their cognition every year. And at some point, whatever your endpoint is for that particular study, some people will not have any cognitive impairment, others will have mild cognitive impairment, and others will have developed dementia. So you can actually see how risk factors relate to change in cognition over time and to incident disease. And then those people who die and come to autopsy, you can see there's going to be a range of pathology from none all the way to more severe. And you can relate the risk factors in people, and see how the pathology may be mediating the disease, or if the risk factors are related to pathology at all. And so we've been able to do that in a single study really very nicely. So, we've been following people for a long time. And so this is what decline looks like in just, regular people. So this is a spaghetti plot of like about 150 people, 150 Blacks and whites. And what I'm trying to show you is the age is plotted on the x-axis and the performance on cognition is on the y. So higher numbers are better performance and lower, negative numbers are worse performance. And the black lines are the Black adults and the red lines are the white adults. And you can see that there's a lot of variability in how people change. Like some people decline really fast, others stay kind of stable, and others even get better because of practice effects. But the point is that there's a lot of variability. And if you smooth these out with mixed effects models, this is what you see. I'm showing you two examples here. One, semantic memory on the top, which is just memory for facts, and perceptual speeds on the bottom, which is speeded cognitive tests. And each line is a predicted path of change for a white person on the top and a Black person in blue. So whites are green, Blacks are blue. And you can see that there's really, everyone's getting worse over time, right? As you get older, everyone's going down. But the lines are parallel, suggesting there's no difference in how people change over time. The only thing that we see are differences in the level effects. So whites are always on the top and Blacks are always on the bottom. And that's what I pointed out earlier, is that there's this disparity in cognitive test performance, probably due to education and a lot of other factors, right? But what I want to understand is what's causing this difference in test performance. If people are not changing so much, so differently over time, but they are doing more poorly at each single point in time, that might explain why we think there's a higher prevalence of Alzheimer's dementia. But if I can explain why people are doing more poorly, then maybe we can target, those areas. And so, race is a social political construct. There's nothing about biology when it comes to race, right? We know that it is shaped by historic events. So what I thought was missing from the narrative is the lived experience of older African Americans. And so these are people who would have been born in the 1930s, 1940s, right? And they're now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I have started to ask questions, or we included in our battery questions to get at the lived experience. So one really simple question that we ask is, where were you born and where were you living at age 12? Everyone lives in Chicago now, but about 60% migrated from the South, and mostly like Mississippi, Arkansas. There's a migration pattern. If you ever have read Warmth of Other Suns, it's a great book. But what I found was that people who were born in the South or living in the South at age 12, that's the red bars, they perform more poorly on our tests than those born in the North or living in the North at age 12. Now, there's a lot that was different between the South and the North, right? Especially during the time when these people would have come up. This would have been like the 1940s and 50s. What was one thing that we know was different? Segregated schools, right? And so segregated schools was a huge thing. It happened in the North, but it was really prevalent in the South. And so I have questions in the battery asking about like your segregation experience. Like, how did you attend segregated schools? If so, for how long? And, and other questions to get at what was going on during that time, and, and figuring out how that might serve as a risk factor. Well, we did not find that segregation itself was associated with cognition, but we did find that there was this really interesting interaction, such that those older Blacks who reported being born in the South and attending a legally desegregated school, the bar there, had the worst performance of anybody in the sample, including the other Black adults who were going to schools in the South in segregated schools. Now, I thought that segregated schools would be worse because they had fewer resources. Maybe the teachers were, not the same quality. And I totally did not expect this. But after talking to my participants and trying to get feedback on this, two things stood out. One was that this was a stressor for people. Imagine they're 6 and 7 and they're going to school and there's all these parents throwing stuff at them and spitting at them. And, so this is a stressor that we can measure 50, 60 years later in their cognitive test performance. It's been shown for the Holocaust survivors. It's been shown for lots of different, traumatic events in early life. So this is another example of an early life traumatic event. But the other thing that I didn't realize about the segregated schools was they may not have had resources, but they had people who cared about them, people who nurtured them, people who wanted them to succeed. And so that was like probably a resilience factor, right? That really helped them, do better. Now they still are doing a little bit poorly than those in the North, but they're doing much better than the ones who attended a desegregated school. And this is not to say that desegregation was bad. It's just thinking about the context of what was happening during that time. And so, of course, I've also, wanted to understand discrimination, because that is a very pertinent experience for Black adults, especially in this age group. They went through some horrific things that we can't even imagine. And so, we've used the Williams Everyday Discrimination Scale, and we have looked at a range of different outcomes, cognition, depression, blood pressure, quality of life, neuroimaging, mortality, you name it. And we find, the same thing, that discrimination is a potent stressor that affects all of these different outcomes for our older adults. This is just an example of cognition finding. We were one of the first to look at discrimination in cognition because most studies had looked at just younger people. And we found that people who reported more discrimination have worse performance on global cognition, but also episodic memory and perceptual speed, which are key cognitive domains affected in Alzheimer's disease. But we've looked beyond discrimination and looked at just perceived stress in general. And we find that those who report more perceived stress, we use the Cohen perceived stress scale, they decline faster in episodic memory and visual spatial ability than those who report less stress. And we've even started to ask about John Henryism, which is a coping mechanism, a bad coping mechanism that had really only been looked at with heart disease and mostly in Black men. And we found that those who reported more John Henryism, so using that active coping, they have worse cognition. And it's, similar in effect to having fewer years of education. So, how you cope with stress is also important. So, we're finding that these risk factors that are relevant to the lived experience of older African Americans are related to cognition. This was absent from the literature because, we weren't included in these kinds of studies. But, with this kind of a design, you can also start to ask questions about the potential mechanisms linking risk factors to cognition. And I'll just go through this, kind of quickly because it's not really the point. But, one thing that we wanted to understand was inflammation. And I know some of you are studying inflammation. We know it's involved in the pathogenic process that leads to dementia. It's associated with cognition and white matter hyperintensities, but it's mostly been in cross-sectional studies, mostly with white people. But we know that inflammation is higher in Black adults due to lots of chronic comorbidities and allostatic load. So in one study, we looked at discrimination and C-reactive protein. This was work I did with Tanae Lewis in my cohort and found, a nice dose response such that people who reported more discrimination had higher C-reactive protein in their blood. We also have looked at this with neuroimaging. So, we do MRIs in the study. So that means I had to have a medical physicist, an MRI specialist. But we found that people who report more discrimination have these changes in their functional networks, and it's the same areas involved in trust perception. So it's suggesting a biologic footprint for discrimination that you can see in the brain. But that's still not telling us the mechanism, right? So I was working with someone who was doing an F31, and she wanted to understand how the association between changes in inflammation and changes in cognition and white matter hyperintensities, which you measure in the brain scan, how that was related in older Black adults, and wanted to understand whether experiences of discrimination might modify these relationships. So she used just a subsample of my participants, about 114. You can see their demographics there, and they all had, follow-up cognitive tests. They had MRI, where she could actually measure the white matter hyperintensities. And she included C-reactive protein, IL-6, and TNF-alpha in her sample, and she looked at change scores to see how these inflammatory markers changed. This is a picture of the brain showing the white matter hyperintensities. You can kind of see the red outline on the right. That's someone with a lot of white matter hyperintensity burden compared to someone who has less on the left. So she quantified all of these in the 114 participants. And then she had a number of covariates of interest that she controlled for in her study. So she didn't find any association between change in inflammation and global cognition. She also didn't see anything between change in inflammation and white matter hyperintensities, but she did see another interaction. So this is another sort of take home message. Like if you don't see a main effect, you should look, there might be an interaction going on in like some special subgroup. So she found that she found that if you look at the graph on the left, so there's really nothing going on in people who have decreases in CRP over time, regardless of your discrimination level. So those lines are on top of each other. But in those people who had increases in CRP, so their inflammation is going up over time, she found that those people who reported more discrimination had a faster decline in perceptual speed than those who had low discrimination. So here is an example of how discrimination as an experience is modifying the effect between inflammation and cognition. And so this is currently under review. Hopefully she'll get it published. So that's just an example of what you can do to look at mechanisms when you have this sort of a design. So just to conclude, and you guys had no questions, so I hope you have questions now. Studying cognitive aging and dementia in older Black adults really requires outreach and education. It requires diverse interdisciplinary teams of investigators and staff. It requires incorporating a relevant narrative to address disparities. And it requires giving back, especially if you're working with community. And so I think sort of the take-home message for me is that leveraging the expertise of different types of scientists, what some people call team science, will actually help us advance the science of health equity and help us to answer a range of questions. You know, I've been able to answer questions of the epidemiology of aging, the mechanisms relating risk factors to cognition, and also because I'm getting brains, really understanding the underlying biology of dementia and cognitive impairment. So I just want to acknowledge the funders for all of the work that I've had over the past, 20-something years, and my study participants, because without them, I would not have done any of this work. And talk about interdisciplinary team. This is our faculty at our center, and I don't have their expertise, but we have neurologists, neuropsychologists, geriatricians, epidemiologists, did I say neuropsychologists, nurses, everybody you can think of, to address a really, really complicated disease. And because of this kind of partnership, we're able to look like a really strong team when we go in for our grants. The other important point is that, these data are available, these and so much others, no matter what you are studying. If you go to this resource sharing hub, you can see all the different cohorts. We have African Americans, we have Latinos, we have whites, we have brains, we have blood, we have all the different kinds of omics. And we're always constantly adding data to our portfolio. So now I'm collecting food frequency questionnaires to understand how diet is related to cognition. I have smart homes where we've outfitted people's houses with sensors to understand their movement patterns and how that might be a sensitive biomarker for dementia. So just so much you can do once you have the cohort. And I'm always happy to add things, as long as it's not too burdensome, or, just ask a question in a way that it hasn't been asked before. So I'll stop there and take any questions.